My name is Percival Hammond. I am 51 years old, and I've worked as first mate on Great Lakes freighters for 27 years, primarily on bulk carriers hauling iron ore, coal, and grain across Lake Superior, the largest and deepest of the Great Lakes. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Please. Lake Superior is the world's largest freshwater lake by surface area, over 31,000 square miles, with depths exceeding 1,300 feet in water. So cold, it never rises above 40 degrees even in summer. I've sailed these waters for nearly 3 decades, on vessels up to 1,000 feet long, moving cargo between ports in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario. This happened last October, during a routine crossing from Duluth, Minnesota to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, a voyage of about 350 miles that normally takes 24 to 30 hours, depending on weather and seas. We were aboard the MV Edmund Fitzgerald II, a 950-foot bulk carrier named after the famous freighter that sank in 1975, carrying 68,000 tons of taconite pellets. We departed Duluth around 6 p.m. on the 12th of October, in good weather, with forecasts calling for moderate seas and winds. The crossing was routine for the first 12 hours, steaming northeast across open water, with normal engine operations, and no issues. Around 6 a.m. on the 13th of October, about halfway across Superior, and maybe 80 miles from the nearest land, our radar started showing something unusual, a contact, approximately 400 yards off our port beam, keeping perfect pace with our vessel. We were making 15 knots, standard speed for loaded freighters, and this contact was matching our speed exactly, staying at that same distance. I was on watch at the time and called the captain to the bridge. We observed the radar contact for maybe 30 minutes. It maintained perfect position relative to our vessel, never getting closer or farther away, moving in exact synchronization with our course and speed. This is extremely unusual. No vessel on Superior can maintain that kind of precise station, keeping without sophisticated navigation systems, and radar showed this contact was much smaller than any commercial vessel, maybe 100 feet long at most. The captain tried radio contact on all standard channels, calling for identification. No response. We couldn't see anything visually. There was light fog reducing visibility to maybe a quarter mile. The radar contact was clear and solid, definitely something physical, not a malfunction. Around 7 a.m., the contact suddenly accelerated, moving ahead of our vessel at what radar calculated as over 40 knots, a speed that is impossible for any conventional watercraft on Superior. The contact pulled ahead maybe 2 miles, then stopped dead in the water directly in our path. The captain ordered a course change to avoid whatever was blocking our route. We altered course 10 degrees to starboard. The contact immediately moved, repositioning itself directly in our new path. The captain altered course again, 20 degrees to port this time. The contact moved again, staying ahead of us. This continued for maybe 20 minutes, with us changing course repeatedly, and the radar contact adjusting its position each time to stay in our path. Finally, the captain ordered all stop, bringing our 950-foot vessel to a halt in open water, something captains avoid if possible because it disrupts schedules and wastes fuel. We sat dead in the water for maybe 10 minutes, watching the radar contact. It remained stationary about 2 miles ahead. Then, suddenly, it dove. The radar signature changed from surface contact to subsurface, showing depth disappearing from our surface radar, but briefly appearing on our depth sounder, showing something at about 300 feet below us, then vanishing completely. We resumed our voyage and completed the crossing without further incident, arriving at Sault Ste. Marie about 4 hours behind schedule. The captain filed a report with the company and the Coast Guard, describing an unidentified surface contact that interfered with our voyage. The official response was that we'd probably track the submarine, even though submarines don't operate on the Great Lakes and can't reach Superior through the lock system. But I talked to other Great Lakes sailors, people I've known for decades working these waters. Several admitted privately they'd had similar experiences on Lake Superior specifically, in the deepest sections of the lake far from shore. Radar contacts that pace vessels, objects that move at impossible speeds. things that seem to deliberately interact with ships. One captain with over 30 years on Superior told me about an experience in the 1990s. His vessel was followed by a radar contact for over 6 hours crossing from Duluth to Thunder Bay. The contact maintained perfect formation off his stern, matching every course change, then dove and disappeared when they approached port. He filed a report, but was told it was probably a false radar echo, even though the signature was solid for 6 hours. The Ojibwe people, whose ancestral territory includes all shores of Lake Superior, which they call Gichigami, the Great Sea, have traditional knowledge about beings that live in the deepest parts of the lake. According to their teachings, there are creatures in the underwater canyons and trenches that are intelligent and powerful. They're curious about the large ships that cross their territory, and they sometimes interact with vessels in ways that demonstrate their monitoring human activity on the lake. I continue working Great Lake shipping because it is my career, and these are some of the most important commercial waterways in North America. But I am more aware now that Lake Superior, despite being freshwater, has depths and mysteries comparable to the ocean. When radar shows contacts that move at impossible speeds and seem to deliberately interact with our vessels, when something paces a 950-foot freighter for miles, then dives to depths over 300 feet, I document it carefully, and I acknowledge there is more in these waters than commercial shipping traffic and known fish species. Lake Superior contains over 3,000 cubic miles of water, with underwater canyons, trenches, and geological formations that have never been fully explored, even with modern sonar. Perfect habitat for something that wants to remain unknown while monitoring the large vessels that cross the surface. And based on what our entire bridge crew witnessed and radar documentation and conversations with other experienced sailors, something does inhabit the deepest sections of Superior. Something large enough to show as a solid radar contact. Something that can move at over 40 knots and dive to depths exceeding 300 feet. And something intelligent enough to deliberately position itself to interact with commercial vessels crossing its territory. My name is Fitzgerald O'Brien. I am 46 years old, and I've worked as a backcountry ranger for Isle Royale National Park for 22 years, patrolling and maintaining trails on this remote island wilderness in the middle of Lake Superior. This happened last July during a routine backcountry patrol of the island's northeast section, an area that sees very few visitors, even during peak summer season. Isle Royale is a 45-mile-long island, the largest in Lake Superior, designated as both a national park and international biosphere reserve, famous for its wolf, moose population study, and extreme isolation. The island is only accessible by boat or seaplane, with no vehicle roads and no permanent human residents except park staff during summer. I was on a 5-day solo patrol, checking trails and campsites in an area about 12 miles from park headquarters at Rock Harbor. On the evening of day 3, I was camped at a designated backcountry site near Siskiwit Lake, the largest inland lake on Isle Royale. Around 9 p.m., still light due to northern latitude in July, I heard howling that made me immediately alert. The howling sounded like wolves, which is normal on Isle Royale, where we have an established wolf pack. But these howls were wrong. Isle Royale wolves number maybe 20 to 30 individuals total in the entire island population, and their howls are distinctive, higher, pitched, and with patterns I've learned over 22 years. These howls were deeper, more resonant, and coming from multiple directions around my camp in a pattern that suggested many more individuals than our entire wolf population. The howling continued for maybe 20 minutes, always from multiple positions surrounding my location, creating an almost orchestrated sound. Then it stopped abruptly. Complete silence. No wind, no birds, no normal forest sounds, just oppressive silence that felt unnatural. Around 10 p.m., I heard something large moving through the forest maybe 100 yards from my camp. Breaking branches, heavy footfalls, sounds that suggested something much bigger than a moose, which are the largest animals on Isle Royale. The movement circled my position, staying at roughly the same distance, creating noise that was clearly deliberate. I called out, identifying myself as a park ranger, thinking maybe another backcountry traveler was nearby. Though that seemed unlikely in this remote section. No response. The movement sounds continued circling for maybe 30 minutes. Around 11 p.m., I saw something that made me question my 22 years of experience on this island. Through the trees, maybe 75 yards away, I saw a figure standing upright. The light was fading, but still sufficient to make out a general shape. What I saw was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with a massive build that didn't match human proportions. It stood completely still for maybe 2 minutes, apparently watching my camp, then turned and walked away with a smooth bipedal gait that was clearly natural. I've seen every type of wildlife on Isle Royale: moose, wolves, foxes, numerous bird species. I've seen black bears on rare occasions when they've managed to swim or cross from the mainland. What I saw didn't match any known species. I made a decision based on my training and 22 years of backcountry experience. I was packing up and hiking to a different location, even though it meant navigating trails in near darkness. I collected my essential gear, left my tent, and started hiking the 6 miles to the next designated campsite using my headlamp. As I hiked, I heard sounds pacing me on both sides of the trail, staying just out of sight in the forest, moving through rough terrain that even moose avoid. This continued for maybe 3 miles. Around 1 a.m., the sounds stopped. I continued hiking and reached the alternate campsite around 2 a.m. I reported the incident to my supervisor when I returned to headquarters, describing unusual wildlife behavior and my decision to relocate campsites for safety. The official response was that I'd probably encountered moose or possibly a bear, and I'd made the right decision to move if I felt unsafe. But I talked to other Isle Royale rangers, people I've worked with for years. Several admitted privately they'd had strange experiences in the most remote sections of the island, particularly in the northeast area where I'd had my encounter. Sounds that don't match known wildlife, the sense of being watched or followed, seeing things in the forest that don't fit our understanding of island fauna. One ranger with over 25 years on Isle Royale told me about finding tracks in remote areas that didn't match anything in our wildlife catalog. Large barefoot impressions, far too big for human, showing up in locations where visitor access is extremely rare. He photographed some of these tracks, but never filed official reports because he didn't want to damage his professional credibility. The Ojibwe people, whose ancestral connection to Isle Royale, which they call Minong, extends back thousands of years, have traditional knowledge about island beings that exist separately from the documented wildlife. According to their teachings, there are ancient inhabitants of Minong who were there long before moose and wolves arrived. They're protective of the island's wild character, and they're particularly active in sections where human presence is minimal. I continue working as an Isle Royale ranger because I believe in protecting this unique wilderness, but I am more cautious now during solo patrols in the most remote sections. When I hear howls that don't match our documented wolf population, when I see figures in the forest that don't correspond to known species, I trust my instincts, and I relocate even if it means altering my patrol plans. Isle Royale is one of the least visited national parks, receiving fewer than 30,000 visitors annually, despite its remarkable wilderness. Much of the island's 132,000 acres is so remote that even rangers rarely access certain sections. Perfect habitat for something that wants to remain unknown. And based on what I witnessed in conversations with other longtime rangers, something does inhabit the most remote sections of Isle Royale. Something large enough and intelligent enough to... My name is Bartholomew Jansen. I am 64 years old, and I've worked as a commercial fishing captain on Lake Michigan for 43 years, running a gill net operation out of Two Rivers, Wisconsin, fishing for whitefish and lake trout in the deep waters of the lake. This happened last March during early spring fishing season, when we target whitefish in waters 150 to 300 feet deep along the Michigan, Wisconsin shipping lanes. I operate a 50-foot steel trawler with a crew of 3, setting gill nets that can run for miles in the deep sections of the lake. We'd left port around 4 a.m. to reach our fishing grounds, about 25 miles offshore, in waters averaging 250 feet deep. We set our first string of nets around 6 a.m., standard procedure, running about 2 miles of net at the target depth, using GPS to mark exact locations for later retrieval. Around noon, we returned to haul the first net string. When we started pulling net aboard using our hydraulic hauler, we immediately noticed something wrong. The net was coming up torn, not the normal tears from fish or debris, but systematic damage that looked like something had deliberately shredded sections of the mesh. Over 43 years, I've dealt with every kind of net damage. Seals getting tangled, debris tears, equipment failures. This was different. The tears were too regular, too systematic. Over the 2-mile net string, we found maybe 20 sections that had been torn in similar patterns, as if something had worked its way along the net, deliberately destroying it. We'd lost most of our catch from the damaged sections, maybe 400 pounds of white fish that had escaped through the tears. More concerning was the cost of repairing or replacing 2,000 feet of damaged net, several $1,000s in losses. We set a second string in a different location, maybe 5 miles from the first, thinking we'd hit some kind of underwater debris or obstruction. Around 4 p.m., we hauled the second string. Same result. Systematic damage, torn sections at regular intervals, massive catch loss. I've fished Lake Michigan for over 4 decades and never seen anything like this. We decided to set one more string before heading to port, this time using different net configuration and depth, trying to avoid whatever was causing the damage. Around 6 p.m., as we were setting the third net string, one of my crew members shouted and pointed off the port bow. Maybe 100 yards away, something was surfacing. Not a fish, not any known Lake Michigan wildlife. What broke the surface was large, dark, colored, with a shape that suggested something serpentine or eel-like, but far too massive. We watched for maybe 30 seconds as this thing surfaced, seemed to observe our vessel, then submerged with a powerful tail movement that created a wave we could feel even at 100 yards distance. The crew member who saw it most clearly estimated it was at least 30 feet long, maybe more. We completed setting the third net, but all 3 crew agreed we were unsettled by what we'd seen. Lake Michigan doesn't have anything remotely that large in its known fauna. The largest fish are lake sturgeon, which max out at maybe 8 feet. The next morning, we returned to haul the third net string. The damage was even worse. Not just torn sections, but entire portions of net were missing. Not tangled or broken free, but cleanly removed as if cut away with precision. I filed a report with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, describing extensive net damage from unknown causes and a large unidentified object sighted near our fishing grounds. The official response was that we'd probably encountered debris from shipping traffic or possibly a large sturgeon, and they recommended using different net configurations to avoid damage. But I talked to other commercial fishermen who work Lake Michigan, people I've known for decades. Several admitted they'd had similar experiences, particularly in the deepest sections of the lake. Nets systematically damaged in patterns that don't match normal wear, massive losses of catch, sightings of things in the water that are far too large to be any documented lake species. One fisherman told me about fishing near Milwaukee in the 1980s. His entire net string, over a mile of expensive mesh, disappeared overnight. Not tangled or torn free, but completely gone as if something had removed it deliberately. He found anchor lines cut cleanly, not frayed from stress. He reported it as theft, but investigation showed no other vessels had been in the area. The indigenous peoples of the Lake Michigan region, including the Potawatomi and Menominee nations, have traditional knowledge about water beings that inhabit the deepest parts of the lake. According to their teachings, there are creatures in the underwater canyons and trenches that are protective of certain areas. They don't want excessive commercial harvest from their territories, and they'll damage fishing equipment to discourage operations in locations they consider theirs. I continue commercial fishing because it is my livelihood and my heritage, passed from my father. But I no longer fish certain deep water locations where I've had nets damaged, no matter how productive those grounds might be. When nets are destroyed systematically in patterns that can't be explained by normal causes, when I see things surface that are impossibly large for Lake Michigan's documented fauna, I take that as a message and I fish elsewhere. Lake Michigan reaches depths over 900 feet in its deepest sections, with underwater canyons and geological features that have never been fully explored. Perfect habitat for something that wants to remain unknown. And based on what my crew witnessed and the systematic net damage and conversations with other longtime commercial fishermen, something does inhabit the deepest sections of Michigan, something large enough to show above the surface as a 30-foot serpentine form, something powerful enough to systematically destroy commercial fishing gear, and something that made it very clear my nets weren't welcome in that particular deep water location.